The clock on my laptop blinked 11:47 p.m. I sighed, rubbing my tired eyes. The dim glow of my desk lamp cast long shadows across my cluttered room, and the silence of the night pressed heavily on my ears. Finals were next week, and I was hopelessly behind. My textbooks were sprawled open, notes scattered like confetti, and my coffee cup sat cold and forgotten. I had been at this for hours, but the words on the pages were starting to blur together. I needed a break, but I couldn't afford one. Not yet. I leaned back in my chair, stretching my arms above my head. The house was quiet, too quiet. My roommate, Jess, had gone home for the weekend, leaving me alone in our small apartment. Normally I didn't mind the solitude, but tonight it felt different. The kind of different that makes you glance over your shoulder for no reason. I shook off the unease, chalking it up to exhaustion and too much caffeine. I turned back to my notes, forcing myself to focus. The topic was cellular biology, and I was drowning in mitochondria and ribosomes. My pen scratched against the paper as I tried to summarize a particularly dense paragraph, but my mind kept wandering. The silence was unnerving. It wasn't just quiet, it was hollow, like the world had been emptied out and I was the only one left. And then I heard it, a faint tapping like fingernails against glass. I froze, my pen hovering above the page. The sound came again, soft but deliberate. My eyes darted to the window. The blinds were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of the streetlight outside. The tapping stopped, and I held my breath, waiting. Maybe it was just a tree branch, I told myself. Or a bird. Yeah, a bird. That made sense. But then it came again, louder this time, and it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from the door. My heart leapt into my throat. I swiveled in my chair, staring at the door to my room. The apartment was small, and my room was right off the living room. The door was closed, but not locked. I never locked it when I was home alone. Why would I? The tapping came again, 3 sharp raps. My stomach churned. "Jess?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is that you?" No answer. Of course not. Jess was hours away by now. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling like jelly. The rational part of my brain told me it was probably nothing. A neighbor, maybe, or the wind. But the irrational part, the part that had been fed on too many horror movies, whispered something much darker. I crept toward the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. The tapping had stopped, but the silence was worse. It felt heavy, oppressive, like the air before a storm. I reached for the doorknob, my hand shaking. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. Still no answer. I turned the knob and pulled the door open, just a crack. The living room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. I peered into the shadows, my breath shallow. Nothing moved. The room was empty. I let out a shaky laugh. "Get it together," I muttered to myself. "You're losing it." I closed the door and turned back to my desk, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt colder, and the shadows seemed darker, thicker somehow. I sat down, trying to focus on my notes, but the words swam on the page. My mind kept drifting back to the tapping. What if it hadn't been nothing? What if someone or something was in the apartment with me? I shook my head, trying to dispel the thought. I was being paranoid. I needed to finish studying. I couldn't afford to waste any more time. But then I heard it again. This time it wasn't tapping. It was a voice. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. A whisper, low and guttural, coming from the living room. My blood turned to ice. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was wrong. Inhuman, almost. Like the sound a predator makes before it pounces. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling so badly I could barely unlock it. I dialed 911, but the call wouldn't go through. The screen flickered, then went black. I stared at it in disbelief. It had been at 80% just a minute ago. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from right outside my door. I could feel it like a physical presence, pressing against the wood. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. I needed to get out. Now I grabbed my keys and bolted for the window. My room was on the second floor, but I didn't care. I'd rather break a leg than stay here another second. I fumbled with the latch, my fingers slipping. The whispering was right behind me now, so close I could feel it on the back of my neck. I yanked the window open and climbed onto the sill, not daring to look back. And then I heard it. "Don't go." The voice was clear now, deep and resonant, but wrong. So wrong. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. I froze, my body refusing to move. The air around me grew colder, and I felt something brush against my arm, something cold and slimy, like the touch of a corpse. I screamed and jumped. The fall was shorter than I expected, but it still knocked the wind out of me. I landed hard on the grass, pain shooting through my ankle. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain, and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the street, where the glow of the streetlights offered a small comfort. I collapsed on the curb, gasping for air. My hands were shaking, and my ankle throbbed, but I was alive. I was out. I looked up at my apartment window, half expecting to see something staring back at me. But the window was dark, the blinds still drawn. I didn't go back that night. I couldn't. I called Jess from a payphone and told her what happened. She thought I was crazy, but she agreed to come back early. When we returned to the apartment the next day, everything was exactly as I had left it. My notes were still on the desk, my coffee cup still cold. The door to my room was closed, just like I had left it. But there was one difference. On the floor, just inside the door, was a single word scrawled in the dust. Stay. I moved out the next day. I didn't care about the lease or my security deposit. I couldn't stay there, not after what happened. Jess thought I was overreacting, but she didn't hear the voice. She didn't feel that cold, slimy touch. I still don't know what it was. Maybe it was a ghost, or a demon, or something else entirely. All I know is that it wasn't human, and it didn't want me to leave. I've tried to put it behind me, but sometimes late at night when I'm studying alone, I hear it again. A faint tapping like fingernails against glass. And I know it's not the wind. It's looking for me.
I've always been a night owl. Ever since high school, late nights were my sacred time, when the world went silent and I could finally focus. My mom used to scold me for staying up too late, warning me that nothing good ever happens after midnight. I laughed it off then, but now, sitting here in this dimly lit apartment, I wish I had listened. My name is Arjun. I grew up in a strict but loving household. My father was a professor, a man of logic and reason, while my mother was deeply superstitious. She believed in spirits, omens, and energies beyond human comprehension. I took after my father, always skeptical, always dismissive of my mother's hushed warnings about the unseen forces that lurk in the dark. That skepticism was my shield, until one night, when it shattered completely. It started as a normal evening. I had a crucial exam coming up, and as usual, I procrastinated until the last possible moment. By the time I sat down with my notes, it was already close to midnight. My roommate, Samir, had gone home for the weekend, so I was alone in our small apartment. The silence should have been comforting, but for some reason that night it felt oppressive. The air was heavy, and shadows seemed to stretch further than they should. I shook off the unease, chalking it up to exhaustion. As I settled in, I heard a faint tap, tap, tap against my window. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, so it couldn't be a person. Probably a tree branch, I reasoned, but when I looked outside, there was no tree in sight. The tapping stopped, but the sense of unease didn't. I forced myself to focus, scribbling down notes, highlighting text, ignoring the chill creeping up my spine. Minutes passed. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadow, by my bedroom door. My breath hitched, and my pulse pounded in my ears. The door was closed. I was alone. I turned my head slowly, but there was nothing there. Just my mind playing tricks on me, I assured myself. Too much caffeine and too little sleep. Then my desk lamp flickered. I froze. A few seconds later, it flickered again. This time, it shut off completely. Darkness swallowed the room. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking. The screen lit up, casting a dim glow, and I turned on the flashlight. My heart was a hammer against my ribs, but I told myself to stay calm. Power outages happen, right? That's when I heard it. A whisper, faint, just behind me. I spun around, flashlight beam darting across the room. Empty. My breath came in shallow gasps. I wasn't imagining things. I couldn't be. The whisper came again, closer this time. Arjun. My name. My legs refused to move. My body was frozen in sheer terror. Slowly, I turned towards my bedroom door, and my stomach dropped. The door was open. I had closed it. I was sure I had. Something was in here with me. I bolted, sprinting out of my chair. I ran to the main switchboard and flipped the lights back on. The room flooded with artificial brightness, and just like that, the terror receded. Everything looked normal. My desk, my bed, my bookshelf, nothing out of place. I exhaled shakily, rubbing my face. I was losing my mind. Then I noticed something that turned my blood ice cold. My notes. They were no longer on my desk. They were on the floor, scattered, as if someone had swiped them off in a fit of rage. I wasn't alone. The air felt charged, like before a storm. And then I heard the whisper again, this time right next to my ear. Run. I did. I didn't stop until I was outside the building, panting, my heartbeat wild. The streetlights buzzed above me, casting long, eerie shadows. I stood there, trembling, trying to rationalize what had just happened. Was I hallucinating? Stress? Sleep deprivation? But I knew, deep in my gut, that something unnatural had been in that room with me. That night, I didn't go back. I crashed at a friend's place, too scared to return alone. The next morning, I forced Samir to come back with me. We found my room exactly as I had left it, except for one thing, my desk lamp. The bulb had shattered, but what terrified me the most was the message scrawled into the wood beneath it. You stayed up too late. I moved out a week later. To this day, I never study past midnight, and I never, ever ignore the feeling of being watched. Because now I know some things in the dark are watching back, Gar.
I never believed in the supernatural. I grew up in a logical household where every creak of the floor was dismissed as the house settling, and every flickering light was attributed to faulty wiring. My mother, however, was different. She always warned me about studying too late into the night. The mind is most vulnerable past midnight, she used to say. I thought it was just an old superstition, until one night I learned otherwise. I was a university student, cramming for my finals in my dimly lit apartment. My roommate, Akash, had gone home for the weekend, leaving me alone with my books and a pot of coffee. I was determined to pull an all-nighter, so I set up my workspace, textbooks open, laptop glowing, and a soft playlist humming in the background. At around 2 a.m., my focus started wavering. My eyes grew heavy, and the words on the pages blurred together. Just as I was about to call it a night, I heard a faint scratching noise. It came from the corner of my room, near my closet. I turned my head sharply. Nothing. Just the same cluttered space, the same pile of unfolded clothes. Shrugging it off as my imagination, I returned to my notes. But the scratching came again, louder this time. My heart pounded. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it at the closet. The door was slightly ajar. I didn't remember leaving it open. Swallowing my fear, I walked over and yanked it fully open. Nothing. Just as I exhaled in relief, my laptop screen flickered. Then the music stopped. The silence in the room was deafening. A shiver crawled down my spine. Something was off. Then I saw it. On my laptop screen, where my notes should have been, was a message typed in a language I didn't recognize. The letters were erratic, jagged, as if written in haste. The screen glitched, and a new message appeared. You shouldn't be awake. I slammed the laptop shut and backed away, my breath coming in short gasps. The room felt colder, the shadows darker. A presence lurked in the silence, watching me. Then the scratching returned, but this time, it wasn't from the closet. It was coming from beneath my bed. Panic surged through me. I wanted to run, but fear rooted me in place. Slowly, hesitantly, I crouched down, my trembling hand reaching for the edge of the blanket hanging over the bed frame. A low whisper slithered through the darkness. Too late. I didn't stay to find out what it meant. I bolted out of the room, down the hallway, and out of the apartment into the cold night air. I spent the night in the lobby of my building, wide-eyed and shaking. The next morning, when Akash returned, we went back to the room together. Everything was as I had left it, except for my laptop. The screen was cracked and the keyboard was dented, as if someone had pounded on it in rage. I moved out the next week. To this day, I refuse to stay up past midnight. I don't know what I invited that night, but I do know this: some warnings should never be ignored.
The clock on my laptop blinked 11:47 p.m. I sighed, rubbing my tired eyes. The dim glow of my desk lamp cast long shadows across my cluttered room, and the silence of the night pressed heavily on my ears. Finals were next week, and I was hopelessly behind. My textbooks were sprawled open, notes scattered like confetti, and my coffee cup sat cold and forgotten. I had been at this for hours, but the words on the pages were starting to blur together. I needed a break, but I couldn't afford one. Not yet. I leaned back in my chair, stretching my arms above my head. The house was quiet, too quiet. My roommate Jess had gone home for the weekend, leaving me alone in our small apartment. Normally I didn't mind the solitude, but tonight it felt different. The kind of different that makes you glance over your shoulder for no reason. I shook off the unease, chalking it up to exhaustion and too much caffeine. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just the caffeine. It was the memories, the ones I tried so hard to bury, the ones that always seemed to surface when I was alone in the dark. I grew up in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. My parents were quiet people, the kind who kept to themselves. My father was a mechanic, his hands always stained with grease, and my mother worked at the local library. They weren't perfect, but they loved me. At least that's what I told myself. When I was 8, my younger brother Sam was born. He was a happy kid, always laughing, always curious. But when he was 5, he got sick, really sick. The doctor said it was leukemia. I remember sitting in the hospital holding his tiny hand, promising him he'd be okay, but he wasn't. He died 6 months later. After that, everything changed. My parents grew distant, like they were living in separate worlds. My father buried himself in his work, and my mother spent hours at the library, avoiding the house. I was left to fend for myself, to navigate the grief and guilt that came with losing someone so young. I blamed myself for not being able to save him. I still do. When I turned 18, I left home and never looked back. I moved to the city, started college, and tried to build a new life. But no matter how far I ran, the past always seemed to find me. The tapping startled me out of my thoughts. It was faint, like fingernails against glass. My eyes darted to the window. The blinds were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of the streetlight outside. The tapping stopped, and I held my breath, waiting. Maybe it was just a tree branch, I told myself. Or a bird. Yeah, a bird. That made sense. But then it came again, louder this time. And it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from the door. My heart leapt into my throat. I swiveled in my chair, staring at the door to my room. The apartment was small, and my room was right off the living room. The door was closed, but not locked. I never locked it when I was home alone. Why would I? The tapping came again, 3 sharp raps, my stomach churned. "Jess?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is that you?" A guttural whisper, clawing through the door. My phone died mid-911 call. The knob rattled. "Run!" I scrambled for the window, the whisper now at my neck. "Don't go!" Something cold grazed my arm, rotten, wet. I jumped. The fall sprained my ankle, but I ran. Jess found me trembling on the curb. When we returned, my notes were untouched, coffee cold. But in the dust by the door, "Stay." I moved out the next day. Jess rolled her eyes, but she didn't hear it, didn't feel its slimy breath. Now, when I study late, the tapping returns. Not the wind. It's searching. Maybe it's tied to Sam, my brother who died when I was young. Maybe guilt conjured it. Or maybe some things don't need reasons. They just hunger. The past never stays buried. Sometimes it crawls back.
I have always been a night owl. Ever since my teenage years, I felt most productive when the world was quiet, with nothing but the hum of my laptop and the ticking of my old wall clock. My grandmother always warned me though. She said there were things lurking in the dark that thrived on exhaustion and solitude. I brushed it off as old folklore, until one night I realized she might have been right. It was my final year of university and I was drowning in assignments. With deadlines looming, I had no choice but to stay up late. My apartment was empty. My roommate, Karen, had left for a family emergency. It was just me, a dimly lit room, and the overwhelming silence of the night. At exactly 2 a.m., a strange sound broke the silence. It wasn't coming from outside, but rather from inside my apartment. A soft, rhythmic tapping. I assumed it was just my overworked mind playing tricks on me and continued typing. But then, something changed. The tapping turned into knocking. Slow, deliberate. I froze, my fingers hovering above the keyboard. The sound was coming from my study table, right beside me. I turned my head slowly, my breath caught in my throat. Nothing. Just my books, my coffee cup, and my flickering desk lamp. I shook my head, forcing myself to focus, but the unease gnawed at me. Just as I convinced myself that I had imagined it, my laptop screen flickered. My document glitched, the text scrambling and reforming into a single sentence. Turn around. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounded in my ears. I turned my chair ever so slightly, just enough to glance over my shoulder, and I saw it, a shadow, not cast by light, but something darker. It stood by the corner of my room, shifting unnaturally, as if it were struggling to hold its form. 2 hollow voids where eyes should have been. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then it whispered my name. I shot up from my chair, knocking over my books. My body screamed at me to run, but my legs felt cemented to the floor. The air grew colder, pressing against my chest. The thing in the corner took a step forward, its movement jerky and wrong. Then My desk lamp exploded. The room was swallowed in darkness. I fumbled for my phone, my trembling hands barely able to grasp it. The flashlight came on, and I swept the beam across the room. It was gone. I grabbed my keys and ran out, leaving my laptop, my books, everything behind. I stayed at a friend's place that night, refusing to go back until morning. When I finally returned, my study table was overturned, and my laptop screen was cracked. Scratched into the wooden surface of my desk was a message, carved deep as if by unseen nails. You were warned. I moved out the next day. To this day, I refuse to stay up past 1 a.m., and I never ever study alone at night.